Hi, my friends. We are going to talk about invertebrates with this lecture series, and I'm going to start with the introduction. So, invertebrate classification, we should know from here until we start plants that we are in kingdom Animalia. There are 30 different phyla of invertebrates. I would highlight that these guys are in kingdom Animalia. Generally, compared to vertebrates, the size is generally small. They're generally a lot more slow moving because they're not quite as advanced usually. And it's basically 98% of the Earth's animal species are invertebrates. No backbone, I would probably highlight that. No cell walls, and generally reproduce sexually. We talked about these different types of symmetry a couple chapters ago, maybe in the last chapter. Radial symmetry are these guys up at the top, and they are the wheel or the pizza or the cake. As long as you go through the middle, anywhere you go through that middle, you're going to get equal halves. Okay, so think circle, think pizza, cake, pie, all those food examples that I gave you guys. Bilateral, remember that bi means two, lateral means side. So these guys, you can only go one way down the middle, and you have right and left halves that generally mirror each other and have a distinct front and back end. So we would have bilateral symmetry. I would highlight this whole slide. The germ layers are the tissues that animals develop from. So let's go ahead and break down these words real quick. The prefix ecto means outside, and derm means skin or tissue. So this is the outside layer. Meso means middle. Endo means inside. I would highlight these three. You have a diploblast. Di means two. These are animals that develop from only two germ layers. Ectoderm and endoderm. These are your more simple animals. Generally includes your cnidarians, which are your jellyfish and their relatives. And these are the organisms that have radial symmetry. So again, think that wheel. I would highlight the word diploblast, and I would highlight two. Triploblast is usually all other animals besides sponges and cnidarians. These are animals with three germ layers. Triplo means three. These animals usually have bilateral symmetry, and I would also highlight triplo and three. So these layers develop into different things when you are in utero. The ectoderm develops into the nervous system, portions of the integument, which are your outside layers, so your skin, nails, hair, scales, sweat glands, and then the epidermis is the outer layer of your skin. The mesoderm develops into a lot of the internal stuff, like the wall of the gut, organizing internal organisms or organs. And the endoderm develops into the lining of all of the internal organisms. So as far as anatomical terms, these are sometimes hard for kids, so you're going to hang with me. This guy is in proper anatomical position. Um, this midline right here divides him in half. Okay? And we're going to go over all of these, but very, very quickly. Superior means more towards the top, inferior more towards the feet. Lateral is more towards the outside of the body. Medial is more towards the middle. You can remember M and M. On your appendages, which are your arms and your legs. Distal would be farther away from the body. Proximal is closer. So if you think the word proximity means in the area, proximal is closer in the area of the body. So this is the first one, superior and inferior. The example I always give is Mrs. Look is my superior, which means she is above me. She's my boss, basically. So that means above. Inferior means below. So if you put your finger on your nose, then put your finger on your mouth, the nose is above the mouth, and that means it is superior to the mouth. The abdomen, so put your finger or your hand, I guess, on your abdomen. and then slide it up to the chest. The abdomen is inferior or below the chest. As far as anterior and posterior, that means front and back. So in us, that would be our face side versus our back side, I guess. The heart is anterior or more towards the front than the spinal cord. Medial and lateral, remember I said M and M. Medial is more towards the midline. So if you put your finger on your ear and then move it to the nose, the ear is lateral or farther away from the midline than the nose. The sternum is your breastbone, and that is right underneath your throat, is medial to the ribs. So your ribs are out and you move in to get to the sternum. Cephalid and caudal, this is used for other organisms besides humans, and that means towards and away from the head. Distal and proximal are farther and closer to the trunk on your appendages, so your arms and your legs. So the fingers are distal to the elbow. The fingers are farther away from the body than the elbow is. The knee is proximal to the toes. So the knee is closer to the body than the toes are. Dorsal ventral, these are words I will use a ton during dissection. You should highlight, underline, star these. Same as front and back or anterior, posterior in humans. And then superficial and deep means towards and away from the body surface. So the skin is on the surface that is superficial to your muscles. The lungs are deep to the ribs. So the lungs are more inside the body than the ribs are. And that would make sense because the ribs are protection for the lungs. So this is some practice. You should pause the video and see if you can use these words to fill in these blanks, and then I will go over them. Starting up at the top, the wrist is proximal to the hand, but distal to the shoulder. The trachea is anterior to the spine, meaning closer to the facial side. The brain is superior or on top of the spinal cord, and the tip of the nose is medial or closer to the midline than the cheekbones. The bodies of organisms can be divided into lots of different planes as well. This diagram shows the different planes. The sagittal plane divides it into right and left halves. The coronal or frontal plane divides it into front and back. And the transverse plane divides it into top and bottom. So this guy right here tells you exactly what I just did. Frontal or coronal divides it into anterior and posterior parts, or front and back. Sagittal is left and right halves, and horizontal or transverse separates it into top or bottom. So like that one, I like to say, if I took a sword and just kind of chopped you in half, I would be chopping you on that horizontal plane. Different body cavities that organisms can have. This prefix A means not. Acoelomate means without a coelom or body cavity. That would be this guy right here. All this purple is tissue. Pseudocoelomate means that it's kind of like a false body cavity. So it's got some open area, but it isn't fully open. Pseudo meaning false. And then coelomate means it's got some different cavities. So you got one cavity there, 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 and there, whereas this one's divided, but it's still all kind of one cavity. These are the different phylums that we are going to talk about. And I would say this is probably going to be divided into a couple different lectures. The first one is porifera, and that is your sponges. It comes from the Latin word porus, which means pore, and fere, which means to bear. So basically it has pores. Characteristics, I would highlight that it has no definite symmetry. They are asymmetrical. These are probably the most simplistic organisms that we're going to talk about. There's no true body cavity. They are all sessile, which means they are non-modal. You should know what that word means. It means non-moving. They can reproduce both ways. No nervous system. It does have a distinct larval stage, which means It does have a younger stage versus an adult stage. They are mostly marine, found in seawater. They are filter feeders, so think about a water filter you might have. They filter things out as food, and they have a skeleton that's made of spicules. Some other structures, collar cells or choanocytes, move water through the sponge. Penocytes, what they do is they help control how much water goes through the sponge. In-current pores brings water in. Excurrent, EX means out, and that is also called the osculum, and that's where water leaves. The mesenchyme or mesohyl is the sponge body. Is made of kind of like, I mean, for lack of a better word, a spongy material. And then a spicule is the different parts of the kind of structure or skeleton of the sponge. Here you see a diagram. Excurrent or the osculum is where water goes out. Choanocytes are these kind of flagella looking things. Those control how much water is going in and out. In-current pores are right here, and then the mesenchyme is what holds the sponge together. Two different types of reproduction: internal fertilization, which means egg and sperm are fertilized inside an organism. Asexually, we talked about budding. You have a portion of the sponge that goes, breaks off and starts growing on the floor. And this is called a gemule. It's protection from hard conditions. So what happens is kind of like a cocoon or a covering is over the sponge, and then once conditions are okay for it to grow, it starts to grow into a sponge. I would highlight all three bullets. These are just a couple of examples. These are pretty cool looking. The yellow tube sponge. They also have this in pink. And this one's kind of cool here. This just shows you another example of the different portions of a sponge. And this would be the next phylum that we will start with on the next lecture.